How was EDM born? Let's go through this journey together, one date at a time. Ciao Ne, Trenders here. Let's start simple. What's the first EDM song ever? It's a common custom to consider Kraftwerk as the pioneers of EDM music, as many people define the homonym album, released in 1970, as the first EDM album, although the real first EDM song was released in 1968, a couple of years prior, and it's called Oscillations by Silver Apples. In fact, even Moby, the famous American producer, said that his friend Simon, one of the members of the group Silver Apples, invented dance music. Silver Apples was an American electronic rock band formed in 1967, and they were among the first to introduce electronic sounds into rock. The first electronic music, though, could be dated way back in 1897 with the invention of the telharmonium. The telharmonium was a sort of electric organ that worked by combining simple sounds through a technique called additive synthesis, which basically works by combining sine waves to create more complex sounds. Fun fact, it was originally meant to be used to play music through a telephone line. Another key moment in the birth of electronic music is musique concrète. I'm sorry to all the French-speaking people right now. This was a new way of making music invented by Pierre Schaeffer in the 1940s, and it worked by using pre-recorded sounds instead of traditional instruments. However, when magnetic tape became available, he decided to switch to using tape loops, with which he could not only repeat sounds, but also change them electronically. This kind of technique was also used by Delia Derbyshire and Ron Grainer in 1963, when they composed the first electronic theme song for television, the Doctor Who theme music. Every single note was made by working with the tape of a recording of a plucked string, some test tone oscillators, and pure white noise. To think that she managed to do all that, and BBC still didn't credit her enough for her work. By the 50s and 60s, radio producers were using musique concrète techniques regularly. For example, BBC used to air a show called The Goon Show, which used this kind of collage technique. It had a big impact on many electronic and experimental musicians that came later. For example, I don't know, the Beatles used this kind of technique in their track Revolution 9, which was released in 1968. Another group influenced by the show were Pink Floyd. They were among the first artists to make EDM popular, as many people define their albums, like for example The Dark Side of the Moon, to be highly influential in the formation of the EDM scene. Another music genre that is considered to be a predecessor of EDM is Jamaican dub music. It was born in the late 60s and 70s, and it mainly focused on strong rhythms, broken up vocals and melodies, and echo-like sound effects, all while using techniques similar to, once again, musique concrète. Dub producers were also one of the first to introduce reverb and delay effects, and the most common way to achieve it at the time was by using the Roland Space Echo, a type of tape delay, although it's not the first time effects like these were used. In fact, the first reverb effects were produced in the 1930s, and they were obtained by playing recordings in reverberating spaces and then re-recording the sound. The first room reverb, though, was created in 1947 by Bill Putnam, the founder of Universal Audio, who made that band play their tracks and record them in the studio bathroom. Yeah, sometimes the weirdest ideas make the biggest inventions. However, there are other types of reverbs called plate reverbs that sound like this, and they were first invented in 1957. Companies wanted to make reverb easier for smaller studios, and the best way to do it was the EMT-140 reverberation unit. It used a big metal sheet in a wooden box with a transducer and a pickup attached to it. It made great reverb sounds, and you could also change how long they lasted thanks to the motorized damping. But at the same time it was very heavy, almost 217 kilos, and very expensive, so it was originally considered to be an elite technique. This particular machine was commissioned by John Lennon, the Beatles singer, in 1969, or well, to be more precise, 4 of them were commissioned, and one of them is also on sale right now, and it costs almost $75,000. Now, tape loop wasn't just used to make fancy sound manipulation, but also to create the first type of delay, the tape delay. In fact, by changing the length of the tape loop and by adjusting the playback and the recording heads, musicians could control how the echo sounded. Once again, Pierre Schaeffer was one of the pioneers of this technique in the 1940s, but it was soon improved by an American producer called Sam Phillips, who in 1954 created the slapback echo effect, a delay of 60 to 250 milliseconds with minimal feedback.
Kind of like this,
By sending the sound from the tape recorder's playback head to its record head. This technique thickened sounds and was characteristic of 1950s rock and roll vocals, especially present in Elvis Presley's tracks. Among the first proper echo machines, as they were called back then, was the Echosonic, a portable guitar amplifier which had a tape echo built in, and it was first built in 1953 but then gained popularity through country music, but especially rock and roll. Now let's take a step back from music production and focus on EDM in general. Hip-hop was also a huge influence in the birth of EDM. This genre was born in 1973 thanks to DJ Kool Herc, a Jamaican-American DJ who hosted parties that reportedly made the hip-hop culture extremely popular. He developed a technique in the mid-70s which consisted in playing two copies of the same disc on two separate turntables, but only the break section, so that when one break in the first disc ended, the same loop would play on the other disc from the beginning. This technique eventually became what we call now breakbeat. This technique was also made possible by the direct drive turntables, which are the type of turntables that are still being used by almost every DJ in the world. They were invented in 1969 by an engineer at Matsushita, a company that you might know more by the name of Panasonic. Of course though, we cannot talk about EDM in the 70s without talking about disco music. One of the first disco songs, well, one of the first songs in general to use a drum machine, was Family Affair, released by Sly and the Family Stone in 1971. Another huge disco producer was Bidu, an extremely influential figure in the early British disco scene who used synthesizers in many of his songs in the 70s. Although they weren't as played by British mainstream media, they started gaining some traction in underground clubs. In 1977, Donna Summer released I Feel Love, the first high-energy track, as well as the first disco hit that skyrocketed in popularity and that had a completely synthesized backing track. It was produced by none other than Giorgio Moroder and Pete Bollett. If we're talking about EDM history, Moroder is a must quote. He is considered to be the father of disco thanks to his implementation of synthesizers in his works. For example, his album Father of My Son, released in 1972, where he used the groundbreaking Moog synthesizer, a modular synthesizer invented by Robert Moog in 1964 and basically the first commercial synthesizer available. Their subsequent models are still being used in today's music. Moroder was also one of the pioneers of synthpop, a subgenre of pop music that features synths as main instruments. It was already present in progressive rock and also in Kraftwerk's krautrock. In 1971, a synth soundtrack was used in the British movie A Clockwork Orange. A year later instead came out one of the most famous synthpop songs ever, Popcorn, made by the jazz musician Stan Free under the pseudonym Hot Butter. It was a cover of the homonym song made by Gershon Kingsley, and it was made by using a Moog synthesizer. On the same year, Isao Tomita, a Japanese composer, released an album called Electric Samurai Switched on Rock, and it was essentially a compilation of electronic covers of popular songs like Imagine, Let It Be or The Sounds of Silence. Synthpop is also called technopop in some cases. This term was born in 1978 when Yuzuru Agi, a Japanese critic, used it while reviewing Kraftwerk's The Man Machine. Another band that was really influential in the scene was Yellow Magic Orchestra, a band that formed in 1978 in Tokyo and is also considered to be influential for genres like J-pop, electro and techno. Their songs were also among the first to feature sampling techniques. In fact, their surprise hit computer game released in 1978 featured a chop of Martin Dennis' Firecracker and some sounds from Space Invaders and Circus, two notorious arcade games. Synthesizer-based music became popular in 1979, especially after Gary Newman's Cars became the #1 hit in the UK singles chart, and it brought to the rise of artists like Depeche Mode and Eurythmics in the Western scene, whereas Yellow Magic Orchestra inspired synthpop bands like P-Model, Hikashu and Plastics, all formed between 1976 and 1979. Also, polyphonic synthesizers, which were synthesizers able to play more than one note at the same time, were becoming cheaper, and along with the rise of MTV, established in 1981, meant that some British synthpop artists like Duran Duran and Spandau Ballet, respectively formed in 1978 and 1979, would become more popular in the United States as well. In the early 1980s, EDM also saw a huge breakthrough thanks to the birth of the Roland Roland TR-808, which became one of the most influential sounds in the dance scene, both when Marvin Gaye released his song Sexual Healing in 1982, which was the first song that became a hit and also featured an 808 as the main instrument, and also thanks to Afrika Bambaata's Planet Rock, a track still from 1982, which made this type of sound popular in the dance floors. Quite unexpectedly, the TR-808 became discontinued in just 3 years because electronic music wasn't yet mainstream, and also they couldn't find the semiconductors that were essential for the synthesizer to work. Well, it wasn't a complete failure. I mean, it still sold 12,000 units, and also it was immediately succeeded by the TR-909 in 1983. It was the first Roland drum machine to use both samples for cymbals and analog synthesis for other sounds, and it's got a more aggressive sound than the boomy 808. Fun fact, they were both initially sold at the same price of $1,195. But whereas in today's money the 808 cost $4,419, the 909 cost just $3,656. Talk about inflation. However, the disco scene started getting some backlash, as there has even been a riot in Chicago called the Disco Demolition Night. It was a Major League Baseball promotion which invited fans to bring their own disco records to a game between the Chicago White Sox and the Detroit Tigers, and then, between games, they would eventually be blown up on the field. This was a way to celebrate the decline of disco music that rock fans often described as overly commercial and inauthentic. However, the audience of that game wasn't 20,000 people like they hoped, but 50,000. There were so many people more interested in this protest than in the game that when the explosion occurred, rioters rushed onto the field to celebrate, and there have been so many damages to the field that the game had to be forfeited. This event was a significant date for the decline of disco, and especially for the birth of new genres like New Wave in 1980. It's a genre that evolved from punk rock and had pop and electronic elements, although it later became an umbrella term for all popular music styles of the time. Some New Wave's artists were, for example, Duran Duran, that I already mentioned before, but also Wham, the British duo formed in 1981, incredibly famous for their song Last Christmas. Come on, it's basically one of the songs that doesn't get out of your head during November and December. Speaking of, it's almost Christmas now. Be careful, Christmas songs are about to defrost and play on the radio non-stop. In the early 80s, another genre that also became incredibly famous was electro, also called electrofunk, which was a fusion of synth pop, funk and boogie. For example, one of the earlier electro songs was Nunk by Warp 9, released in 1982. And it's during that time that house music was born, thanks to the Chicago American DJ team Hot Mix 5, formed in 1981, who played different styles of EDM at the radio, making it more popular than it ever was, with DJs making their own edits of their favorite songs. The first proper house song is considered to be On and On by Jesse Saunders in 1984, because it had a lot of early house elements, for example the 808 drum machine, the 303 bass synthesizer, as well as simple minimal vocals. Some other sources though describe Music is the Key, released by J.M. Silk in 1985, to be the first actual house track. One of the first tracks that instead gave Chicago House the first glimmer of success in Europe was House Nation by Housemaster Boys and the Rude Boys of House, and this, along with many other house tracks, made its way into the pop charts. Okay, I'm sorry for leaving you here, I know there is a lot more to talk about, but we'll resume next week right where we left off. Thank you for watching, see you next time. Ciao!